Open financial news on any given day, and you will see a stark divide. Developing nations are routinely praised for explosive 5 or 6% annual economic growth. Established economies, on the other hand, are written off for sluggishly expanding at just 1 or 2%. The math seems straightforward. Citizens living under those 6% headlines should be rapidly accumulating wealth, while people stuck in the 1% countries suffer through economic misery. But look at the street-level reality of a supposedly stagnant, low-growth economy like Japan. Here in Tokyo's Ginza district, the infrastructure is immaculate, the shops are high-end, and the pedestrians enjoy an obvious, widespread affluence. Compare that to the daily reality of a booming, developing economy. Despite the massive growth figures celebrated in the press, the physical environment remains crowded, chaotic, and visibly less affluent for the average person. This disconnect happens because those headline numbers rely on total GDP. That metric measures a state's absolute economic power, its ability to build monumental infrastructure or fund a massive military, but it tells you almost nothing about what a normal person actually takes home. Judging a country's standard of living by its total economic output ignores the invisible mathematical force that constantly eats away at those gains: demographics. To measure actual individual wealth, we use GDP per capita. This is simply a country's total economic output divided by its total population. The core economic equation dictates prosperity. Per capita growth equals total GDP growth minus population growth. Economic expansion is tied to how many share the gains. If an economic pie grows, but people grabbing a slice multiply even faster, everyone's portion gets thinner. Let's apply this to developing nations like Bangladesh or emerging states in Africa. On paper, they boast an impressive baseline of around 5% total annual growth. This bar chart shows exactly how that growth is diluted. A large 5% total growth bar is actively pushed down by a population that expands by 1.5 to 3% every year. The actual wealth added per person is drastically slashed. You can see this tension on the factory floor. There is a massive volume of physical output driven by a surging labor force, but it translates to minimal individual prosperity for the people doing the heavy lifting. In hyper-growth nations, millions of new citizens are absorbing the newly generated national wealth just to maintain their current lower baseline of living. Now look back at Japan, an economy widely dismissed for averaging an anemic 1.5% total growth. Japan is experiencing a demographic reversal. Its population is actively shrinking, which flips the math of our core equation entirely in favor of the individual. This chart shows how that works over time. We see a nearly flat total GDP line, but because that slowly growing economic pie is divided among fewer people, the per capita GDP line diverges and steadily rises. That mathematical reality is visible on the streets of Tokyo. Decades of dire financial reports have not stopped Japanese living standards from remaining incredibly high and comfortable. A shrinking population masks sluggish economic performance. It artificially protects individual wealth, even when the national output slows to a crawl. There is one critical caveat to this math. Even if per capita GDP outpaces population growth, it guarantees nothing for the average citizen. In the United States, real per capita GDP has roughly doubled since 1990. Yet over that exact same time frame, median real wages have barely crept up 20%. This area chart shows the distribution problem. The upper line representing average GDP per capita skyrockets, while the lower line representing median income flatlines. GDP per capita is just an average. If all the new wealth is hoarded by a tiny top percentage, the math fails the median worker. Per capita growth only improves society if the newly generated wealth actually circulates evenly across the population, rather than staying trapped at the top. For developing nations aiming to eradicate poverty, building infrastructure and factories is only half the battle. Escaping poverty requires a demographic transition. As industrial development and education expand, birth rates fall, allowing wealth to finally catch up to the population size. As long as a nation's population growth outruns its economic output, true prosperity will remain mathematically impossible, regardless of how much domestic manufacturing scales up. Headline growth figures require the context of a census. National prosperity is the math of the individual. a calculation where the number of people sharing the gains matters as much as the size of the gains themselves. A fast-growing economy means very little if it leaves the average person behind.